The candles had guttered low in the little house at Walworth. It was past midnight, and the summer air came in warm through the open window, carrying the smell of horse dung and river mud from the Thames. Inside the front room, on the narrow bed the family shared, a mother lay sleeping with her 2 small boys pressed against her ribs. In the room above, a young woman lay dreaming of the wedding she believed was only a week away. She was to marry the quiet lodger from Wellington Terrace. He had told her he loved her. He had told her to insure her life for £100. Somewhere on the stairs, a floorboard settled. A hand found the handle of a shoemaker's knife, and the first cry began. A lodger at Wellington Terrace. Good evening, and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian, and I hope the night has grown quiet enough around you that you have found the place you meant to settle in. Tell me, if you will, where you are listening from tonight, and what hour it happens to be on your side of the dark. Some of you will be in a bed with the lamp turned very low. Some of you will be in a chair by a window, with rain on the glass, or the noise of a street you have long since stopped hearing. Some of you will be far from home altogether, in a hotel room in a city whose name I would never guess. Wherever you are, I am glad you came. If you would like to sit with me again on other nights, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a small nudge of a like. It is the plainest of favours, and it costs you nothing, but it is what allows a channel this quiet to keep finding the listeners who need it. When that is done, let us leave the hum of the present behind and go a very long way backward together, into a summer that has been over now for the best part of 200 years. We are going to South London, to the parish of Newington, in the month of July in the year 1860. The month is almost done. The city has been sweltering for weeks. The Thames is running slow and thick under London Bridge, and every window that can be opened has been opened, and the smell of the horse traffic hangs in the warm air, long after the traffic itself has passed. In a narrow terrace not far from the Elephant and Castle, in a set of rooms known then as Wellington Terrace, a young man sits at a small deal table with a sheet of writing paper in front of him and a steel-nibbed pen in his hand. His name is William Godfrey Youngman. He is not yet 25. He is a tailor by trade, though the work has not been steady, and there have been long weeks when he has kept himself only by the shillings his mother has slid across the table to him without a word. He is of middling height and thin build. His hair is dark and cut close. His face, by every account of the people who saw him that summer, is not the face of a man you would look at twice on the Walworth Road. He is polite. He is soft-spoken. He listens more than he speaks. That, more than anything, is what people will remember of him after everything is done. The record does not tell us what the room at Wellington Terrace looked like. Nobody thought to write it down while it still mattered. We know from other lodgings of that year and that quarter of London what such a room was likely to hold. A single bed pushed to the wall, a washstand with a chipped ewer and a basin, a rag of towel on a nail, a candle stub in a tin dish, a small deal table under the window, and one hard chair. On the floor, most likely, a piece of carpet worn through to the boards where a foot habitually rested. On the wall, perhaps a cheap print of the Queen, or of a horse. There would have been a smell of coal smoke in the curtains, and of the paraffin the landlady used to polish the stairs, and beneath it the slow, warm smell of the human body of a man who did not have a great deal of money to spend on soap. We know one thing about the room for certain, because the pen and the paper come into the story again. He was writing letters. Not many, and not to many people, but to one office in particular, on the Strand, and to one young woman in the country. The letters to the office were about a policy of insurance on a life that was not his own. The letters to the young woman were about the wedding they had agreed on, and about the small arrangements of it, and about how much he wanted her to come up from Wadhurst to the city, and how soon she must contrive to do so. He wrote in a firm, upright hand. He signed each letter with his full name. William Godfrey Youngman. I want to slow down for a moment and place him properly, because a man of his kind is very easy to lose in a hurry. Newington, in 1860, was not the desperate quarter that people who have only read about Victorian London sometimes imagine it to have been. It was a working parish of tradesmen and clerks, of small shopkeepers and lodging-house keepers, of shoemakers and printers and men on the railway. The streets were mostly of yellow brick, 3 stories high, with iron railings in front and a flight of stone steps to the door. A house of that kind would hold 2 or 3 families and 1 or 2 lodgers besides, and everyone in it would know everyone else's business by the sound of their tread on the stairs. Wages for a journeyman tailor in that year ran to about £1 a week when the work was there, and there were plenty of weeks when it was not. A pot of beer at the corner house cost a penny. A loaf of bread cost 4pence. A room of the sort William took cost him £0.50 a week, and the landlady, a Mrs. Beard, kept his rent in a small tin on the mantel-shelf and marked it off in a book with a stub of pencil that she wetted at her lips. He had come to that room, so far as the neighbours could later remember, in the spring. He kept to himself. He went out early and came back late, and if he had trouble finding work he did not speak of it. He was seen at the standpipe in the yard on Sunday mornings, washing his shirt. He was seen once at the door of the small chapel at the end of the street, though nobody could say whether he had gone in. He was polite to the landlady's children when he met them on the stairs. He said good morning to the sweep who came on Wednesdays. He seemed, in every way, a young man of no interest whatever to anyone but himself. We know his family only a little better. His father and mother were plain country people who had come up to London years before in the hope of better work, and who had scraped a living together in the ordinary way of the poor in that decade. The father, John Youngman, worked as a labourer when he could. The mother, whose name was also Mary, and who is not to be confused with the girl in Wadhurst, kept the 2 youngest boys with her at the little house in Manor Place, which lies a short walk from Wellington Terrace across the Walworth Road. The 2 boys were still children, aged perhaps 7 and 9. Their names were Thomas and William, though the second William was known in the family by another pet name so that he should not be confused with his elder brother. William Godfrey, the tailor, was the eldest of the surviving children, and by every custom of the parish and the century, the eldest son was the one on whom the hopes of a poor family were hung. I have wondered, more than once while working through the papers on this case, what those hopes actually looked like from inside that house. Nobody wrote them down. We have a mother's few surviving letters, in a plain hand, chiefly about small sums of money and the price of tea. We have a father's testimony given later in a police court, where he speaks of his son as a good boy who had lately grown quiet. We do not have the conversations that were had at the table in Manor Place on a Sunday. We do not have the long silences either. Some of what a family knows about one of its own is never said aloud, and none of it survives when the family is broken. What we do have, plainly, are the letters to the office on the Strand. The office belonged to a life assurance company of the middling sort, well known enough for its brass plate to be respectable and small enough for a young man on an uncertain income to think he might present himself there. The clerks in such offices in that decade were sober fellows in dark coats, with ink on the sides of their fingers and a habit of asking a great many quiet questions without ever seeming to. They kept a large ledger on a slanted desk. They wrote down the name of the proposer and the name of the life to be insured, and the sum, and the annual premium, and the address to which any correspondence should be sent. They took the money in shillings and half-crowns across a mahogany counter, and they gave in return a small square of paper stamped with the company's seal. William began his inquiries with such an office in the early part of the summer. He did not want a policy on himself. He wanted one on a young woman, aged 19, at present in the service of a farming family near the village of Wadhurst in Sussex. He wanted the sum to be £100. He was told that a policy could be issued, provided the woman herself signed the papers and was examined by a medical man, and provided the premiums were paid up to date at every quarter. He wrote back that this would be attended to. He wrote to Sussex to arrange it. He wrote to his own mother in Manor Place to say that the wedding was fixed. £100 is not a large sum to us. It is very hard, from where we are sitting, to feel the weight of it in the palm of a hand in 1860. Let me try to put it plainly. £100 in that year was more than 2 years' wages for a journeyman tailor when the work was steady, and it had not been steady for him. It was the price of a cottage in a country parish, freehold, with a bit of garden. It was enough to set a young couple up in a shop of their own. It was enough for a young man of ambition and no capital to feel as though a door had opened in a wall he had been staring at all his life. He wrote the figure at the head of one of his letters more than once. He underlined it. The letters have been kept because the trial made them famous, and the pen strokes are still there on the paper for anyone who cares to look. We have to pause here for a moment, because it is very tempting, when you know how a story ends, to see the ending in every early line of it. I am trying not to do that. On a July evening in Wellington Terrace, a young tailor at a deal table under a window is writing to a young woman he has promised to marry, and to an insurance office on the Strand, and to his mother across the Walworth Road. Any one of those letters, in the life of any other young man in that parish, would be the sign of an ordinary decent existence being carefully arranged. A wedding, a little household, a small savings against misfortune, the plainest business of the century. Only 2 of the 3 letters, taken together, mean anything of the sort. It is the third one, the small square of paper stamped with the company's seal, that turns the other 2 into something else. And he was the only person in the world, that summer, who could see all 3 of them at once. The candle at his elbow burned down as he wrote. He would have trimmed the wick with the little brass snuffer on the sill, and the flame would have flared and steadied. Outside in the street, a cab went past at a walking pace, and a woman called to a child somewhere along the terrace, and after a while the terrace grew quiet again. He wrote his signature at the bottom of the last letter. He folded it. He addressed it in the same firm, upright hand he used for everything. He set it on the corner of the table beside the others, and he sat for a while looking at nothing, with his hands loose in his lap, in the way a man will sit when he is thinking of a thing that must be done, and turning it in his mind. You and I, sitting where we are, know already what he was thinking of. That is the awful part of any story of this kind. We arrive in the room after the deed is done, and we cannot help but look at the young man at the table, with eyes he does not yet know are on him. He does not know we are here. He does not know the wedding will not happen. He does not know the small house at Manor Place, where his mother is at this hour putting his 2 little brothers to bed, has only a handful of nights left in it. He knows only that he has written his letters, and that the papers on the Strand are in order, and that a young woman in Sussex has agreed to travel up to the city, and that she will be sleeping under his roof within the week. He put out the candle. The room went dark. Somewhere along the terrace a dog barked once, and then thought better of it. In the country, in a small farmhouse near Wadhurst, a girl of 19 was already in bed and asleep. In the front room at Manor Place, a mother and her 2 small sons were also asleep. And in Wellington Terrace, a young man lay down in his clothes and closed his eyes, and the last hot night of that July went slowly on above the rooftops of Newington toward its morning. The girl from Walworth. We are going to leave the city now for a while. Set the sound of London aside if you can, the horses on the cobbles and the hawkers on the corner, and the boil of the Thames at low tide, and come with me south into the counties, where the earth is chalk and clay, and the roads are still dust in a dry summer. Sussex, in the year 1860, was a country of hop gardens and small fields, of oast houses with their white cowls turning in the wind, of narrow lanes hedged tall with hazel and thorn. The railway had reached it, but only in 1 or 2 directions, and only recently. Wadhurst itself sat on a ridge in the high Weald, a market village of stone and weatherboard, with a church whose spire could be seen from a great distance across the fields, and a knot of shops around a wide street, where the coaches from Tunbridge Wells and Hastings still stopped to change their horses. It was the kind of place a Londoner would call a village, and a countryman would call a town. Somewhere in the parish of Wadhurst, at a farmhouse a mile or so out from the church, lived the family of a farm labourer named James Streeter. The record does not give us the house with any certainty. I have looked for it on the parish maps of that decade, and the Streeters do not sit in any one plot for long. Agricultural labourers of that county moved when the work moved. They rented a cottage from a farmer for a year, and then took a cottage from the next farmer up the lane, and the parish register followed them from baptism to baptism as best it could. What we can say is that James Streeter was in the district of Wadhurst in the summer of that year, and that his daughter Mary was old enough to have been in service some while, and that her sister was younger and was still at home. Mary Wells Streeter was 19. She had been born in 1840 or thereabouts. The register is ambiguous on the exact month, and she had grown up in the ordinary way of a labouring family in that part of Sussex. She would have learned her letters at a village school kept by a curate's wife, or at a dame school in someone's front parlour, where the pence were collected in a china cup at the door. She would have learned to read the Bible at her mother's knee, and to write a plain hand well enough to sign her name and put a few sentences down on paper. She would have learned to cook a rabbit, to bake a loaf, to mend a stocking, to card wool, to milk a cow if the farmer kept one, to gut a chicken without shrieking, and to hold her tongue in the presence of anyone whose coat was better than her father's. I want to tell you what she looked like, and I cannot. No photograph of her has come down to us. There is a description read into the court record later, of a girl of middling height, brown-haired, of a fresh country complexion, with hands that had done work all her life. That is all. Two of the newspapers that reported the case put a sketch of her at the head of their columns, but the sketches contradict each other, and neither man drew her from life. So we have to leave her face a shade blurred, and take her instead by the details of her life, which are more honest. By the summer of 1860 she had been in domestic service for 2 or 3 years. Her latest place was with a farming household in the parish, where she was maid of all work at a wage of about £6 a year, and her keep. She would have slept in the attic under the pantiles, on a straw mattress that she stuffed and shook out for herself, with a wooden chest at the foot for her spare clothing. She would have been up at 5 to lay the kitchen fire and set the copper going. She carried water from the pump in the yard, boiled it, sluiced the flags of the passage, laid the family's breakfast, washed the family's plates, and then walked back to the pump for more water before the morning was properly begun. She went to bed at 10 or 1:30, when the household lamps were put out. Come and stand for a moment on the lane outside such a house. The hop poles rise beyond the hedge, tied at the crown into their pyramid shape. A yellowhammer sings on a gatepost. The smell of the smoke from an oast is warm and sweet and settles in the hollows. A dog somewhere barks once at a passing cart and lies down again. This is the world Mary Streeter knew. Later, at the Old Bailey, a barrister in a silk gown will speak of her as the country sweetheart, and he will make the phrase sound almost trivial, as though a country sweetheart were a category rather than a person. She was a young woman of 19 with a family who loved her and a wage of £6 a year, and she had never in her life been further from home than the market at Tunbridge Wells. How she came to know William Godfrey Youngman is one of the gaps in the story. The evidence at the trial spoke of a meeting some months earlier, and of an introduction through a family connection, and of letters that had passed between them since. What is not clear, and what nobody thought to nail down, is whether the introduction was in London or in Sussex. There was a suggestion in one of the papers that she had been in London during the winter, perhaps on a short visit to relatives, and that the two had been introduced at a supper table there. There was another suggestion, at the inquest, that the Streeters and the Youngmans had a distant cousinly link, and that a letter of introduction had gone from one household to the other. Both may be true. It does not really matter. What matters is that by the spring of 1860, a young tailor in Newington and a servant girl in Wadhurst were writing to each other, and that his letters were coming more often than hers were. The letters have not all survived. Some were read into evidence, and some were kept by the police, and some were burnt by the Streeter family after the trial in a plain wish to be rid of them. A handful remain. They are on cheap ruled paper, folded to fit the pocket. His hand is even and upright. Hers is slower, larger at the loops, less certain around the more difficult words. She spelled his name with a G in the middle at every opportunity, as though the G were the mark that made him particular. He always spelled hers correctly. He wrote to her about the weather in London. He wrote to her about a piece of stuff he had seen in a draper's window in the Borough, a dark blue merino that would make up a good travelling gown. He wrote to her about the wedding. He wrote to her about his mother in Manor Place, who was, he said, looking forward to meeting her, and about his 2 young brothers who were, he said, quite wild with curiosity to see her. He signed himself, always, "Your affectionate William," she wrote back at intervals. She was not a natural letter writer, and there are gaps of a fortnight and more between her hand and his. When she did write, she wrote of daily things. The hens were laying well. The master had bought a new colt. Her sister had had a fever and was better again. She hoped he was in good health. She signed herself, "Your loving Mary." She was 19. She had been asked by a young man in London who dressed well and spoke well whether she would consent to be his wife. She had said yes. I have to slow down for a moment here, because it is easy to make a modern mistake at this point. It is easy to want Mary Streeter to have seen through him. It is easy, when you know the ending, to want the young woman in the letters to have paused with her pen in the air and thought better of it. She did not. There is no reason she should have. In the whole of her 19 years she had not met anyone quite like this sober, well-mannered tailor from Newington. He did not drink. He did not raise his voice. He wrote to her regularly, in a hand that showed he had gone to school. He said what he meant. He asked her to be his wife. He talked of a home of their own, in a set of rooms he would take when the wedding was fixed, above a shop perhaps, in one of the neat streets on the Kent side of the river. He said he would work. He said she would not want. In the summer of 1860, in the parlour of a Wadhurst farmhouse, where the tallow candles were kept in the drawer of the dresser because they were dear, that was the shape of a good offer. A girl of her class and place would have been thought a fool to refuse it. Her mother read the letters over her shoulder. Her father, so far as we can tell, was less inclined to be pleased. He was a plain man who had never been to London and did not much see the point of it. He had asked his daughter more than once whether she was sure. She had been sure. Her sister thought it a fine thing that Mary should be marrying a Londoner, and had teased her a shade about it in the kind way of sisters. Her employer, when she gave notice, had wished her well and said that if things did not go on as she hoped in the city, there would always be a place for her at the farm. She had thanked him. She had cried a moment in the kitchen after he was gone. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and went back to peeling the potatoes. We do not know the exact day she left the farm. It was in the last week of July. She packed her wooden chest with what she had. 2 work dresses, a Sunday dress in a dark stuff, a black bonnet, a shawl, a pair of stout shoes, a pair of thin shoes for church, 3 shifts, 3 pairs of stockings, a nightgown, a Bible her grandmother had given her, a tin of hairpins, a comb, a piece of soap wrapped in paper, and a cotton bag of dried lavender to keep the linen sweet. On the top she laid, folded flat, the length of dark blue merino that William had sent her by the carrier for the wedding gown, and a paper of pins from the same parcel. She said her goodbyes at the door of the cottage. She kissed her sister. Her mother pressed a purse into her hand with the fare in it. Her father walked with her as far as the turn of the lane and then stopped. He watched her go on toward Wadhurst with the carrier and did not follow. That is the last picture of her at home that any of them would ever have, and I have often thought that if he had known it he would have gone the extra half-mile. He did not know it. Nobody in that lane knew it. The record does not tell us what he said to her at the parting, and I will not invent it. The carrier's cart took her into Wadhurst. The train took her from Wadhurst to Tunbridge Wells, and from Tunbridge Wells up to London Bridge Station, which had been open a good few years by then, and which received the trains from the south coast in a great smoky arch that rang under the wheels. She had never been in a place so loud. She had never seen so many faces at one time. On the platform, in a dark coat and a plain hat, stood a young man she had been writing to for the best part of a year. He took her wooden chest by the rope handle. He offered her his other arm. She took it. You and I, sitting where we are, would like at this moment to catch her sleeve and to keep her on the platform. We cannot. She walked out with him under the arch of London Bridge Station, into the last hot evening of that July, and the roar of the city closed over her head, and the two of them went south together, across the river, toward Newington. She was to sleep that first night, and the next night in the front room at Manor Place, where his mother sat up late waiting for them, with the kettle on the hob. She was to be married on the coming Sunday. She had a wedding gown to make. She had £100 settled on her name at an office on the Strand, though she did not yet know the sum, and she did not yet know that it existed at all. Somewhere in Newington, in a set of rooms on Wellington Terrace, a candle was already burning at a deal table, and the last of the letters that had brought her across 3 counties into the city sat folded on the corner of it, held down against the warm draught from the open window by the flat of a shoemaker's knife. The weight of £100. We must cross the river now, back into the city proper, and follow him on the errand that made all the rest of it possible. Set aside the picture of Mary at the London Bridge platform for a little while. She is in the front room at Manor Place, learning her way about the kitchen, being kind to his mother, being teased by his 2 young brothers, and she does not need us at her elbow every moment. Come north with me, over the water, up through the traffic of Ludgate, and out into the wide, bright thoroughfare of the Strand. The Strand in the July of 1860 was one of the busiest streets in the Western world. You could not walk its length without stepping around a coal cart. The pavement was of great York stone slabs, worn hollow in the middle by the tread of 2 generations, and the shop fronts ran shoulder to shoulder from Temple Bar to Charing Cross, without a single gap between them. Print shops displayed lithographs of the war in Italy, pinned to the glass. Opticians showed brass telescopes laid on velvet. Dining rooms offered a chop and a pint of stout for a shilling, and barbers shaved a gentleman for 2pence, and the little tobacconists filled their doorways with the smell of Virginia leaf a yard out into the street. Here and there, between the shops and the taverns, sat a plain door with a polished brass plate beside it, and above the plate a discreet upper window with the muslin drawn. Behind one such door, at a number I will not give you because the ledger of that particular firm has not come down to us, and the trial papers were coy about it, was the office of the assurance company to which William Godfrey Youngman had written his letters in the spring. There were dozens of such offices along that one street. The great names of the trade had their marble halls further west, near the parks. The middling houses, the ones that would take a proposal from a journeyman tailor without turning him away at the door, kept their premises here between Somerset House and the Adelphi, in old family buildings with plaster ceilings and staircases of oak. The counter itself was mahogany, waxed to a shine, with a brass rail along the front for a customer's hand. Behind it stood a clerk in a black frock coat and a stiff collar. His hair had been oiled flat and parted in the middle. Cuffs of stiffened linen were buttoned tight at the wrist against the ink. On the desk before him lay an enormous ledger, tilted on a slope, and beside the ledger a tray of steel nibs, a china inkwell, a bone-handled paper knife, a stick of red sealing wax, and a shallow brass dish of fine white sand for blotting. On the wall behind him hung a framed table of premiums, and beside it a lithograph of the firm's founder, a bewhiskered gentleman in a stock, looking down at the room as though he had lately eaten it. William came through that door on more than one occasion. The exact number of his visits is not recorded, but from letters and from later testimony, we know he called at least twice, and probably 3 times, in the weeks before the policy was in force. He would have taken off his hat at the door and held it against his chest. The clerk, if he was not with another customer, would have looked up at once. William gave his name in a level voice. The correspondence was turned out on the counter from a cardboard file, and the clerk asked 1 or 2 of the quiet questions that were the trade of his kind. The proposal for the policy had been made in the ordinary form. William was to be the person insuring the life. Mary Wells Streeter, spinster, of Wadhurst in the county of Sussex, aged 19 years, was to be the life assured. The sum to be paid at her death was £100 sterling. The relationship between the proposer and the life assured was to be stated on the paper, with a printed line for it, and an inkwell on the counter for him to fill it in. He wrote, in his upright hand, that they were affianced, and that they were to be married within the fortnight. The clerk read what he had written, and blotted the page with a rock of the brass sander, and gave a nod that meant nothing in particular. I have to say something plain here about the insurance trade of that decade, because a person listening in a bed today may know only the trade as it now exists. In 1860, a life policy was an ordinary and respectable thing for a working person to arrange. Burial clubs took a penny a week at the door. Friendly societies gathered in the upper rooms of public houses on a Saturday night and paid out on the death of a member. Larger offices, on streets such as the Strand, wrote policies for sums that a labouring man could scarcely otherwise dream of, and they wrote them in great numbers. Nothing in the counter-clerk's day would have marked William out from the 20 other proposers who had crossed his mat since breakfast. A young man wishing to secure £100 on the life of the young woman he was about to marry was, in that trade and that year, the plainest imaginable customer. There was, however, a step that could not be skipped. Before the policy could be issued, the life assured had to be examined by a medical man appointed by the office, and had to sign the proposal with her own hand. The examination was not searching by our standards. A doctor listened to the chest with the wooden trumpet of his stethoscope, or with his ear laid against a folded handkerchief on the shoulder. He counted the pulse at the wrist. He looked into the throat. A short list of questions was asked about the coughs and the fevers of childhood, and about the deaths of parents and grandparents where they were known. The doctor then wrote a paragraph of his opinion in a firm hand on the paper, countersigned it, and pocketed his fee of 1 guinea, which the office paid and added to its books. The medical man for the Streeter proposal was a country practitioner in the district of Wadhurst. His name is in the papers, though it does not help us much to say it here, for he did his part honestly, and stepped out of the story as soon as it was done. He called at the farmhouse where Mary was in service, in the last week of June or the first week of July, at an hour arranged by letter. She was called down from her work in the dairy. She dried her hands on her apron. She stood in the parlour, in front of a country doctor she had seen once before, with the mistress of the house in the doorway as a proper chaperone, while he laid the wooden cup of his stethoscope against the front of her dress and listened. He was pleased with what he heard. She was a healthy young woman of 19, of a country upbringing, with no chest to speak of and no sign of any wasting complaint. She was past fit at once. His hand went across the proposal paper in a firm, sloping script, and he signed it and gave the paper back to her. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the point at which she signed. She sat down at the parlour table. She took the pen the doctor offered her. Her name went on the line he showed her, Mary Wells Streeter, in a round schoolgirl hand, the loops of the Y and the Ra a little larger than the rest. She did not know how much the sum was. Nobody had told her. She had been told only that William was making an arrangement for her benefit against the day of her marriage, and that a signature was needed, and that this was a proper and usual thing between a man and the woman he was about to marry. The doctor did not open the matter with her. It was not his place, and it was not his fee. He blotted the page. He shook her hand. He left. She went back to the dairy. Do you see how easily it was done? That is the part I keep coming back to when I read the file on this case. Nobody in that parlour did anything unusual, or anything they had not done 20 times before. A country girl in service signed a paper in the presence of her mistress and a medical man of good standing in the parish. Nothing about that hour would have been remembered by anyone in that house afterwards, if a great deal else had not happened later to fix it in their minds. The paper went into the post that afternoon. It was on the counter of the office on the Strand within 3 days. William came to the office to complete the business. He brought with him the sum of the first premium, which the tables on the wall behind the counter set at just over £1 for a life of 19 years, at a sum insured of 100. The exact figure in the tables of that firm and that year would have been near to 22 shillings for the first quarterly payment. He paid in shillings and half-crowns. The clerk counted the coins with the flat of his forefinger, sliding them one at a time from the counter into a brass scoop, and dropped the scoop into a locked drawer behind him. The ledger received the amount in a firm hand. The date went beneath it, in the ruled column at the right. The name of the life assured he wrote out in full above them both. A square of stiff paper came off a shelf behind him. He dipped his pen and filled in the particulars. He touched a stick of red wax to the flame of a candle at his elbow, dripped a small pool of it at the foot of the paper, and pressed the office seal into the wax while it was still soft. 22 shillings, in the summer of 1860, was a serious sum for a man of William's income. It was more than a fortnight's rent on the room at Wellington Terrace. It was a whole week's wages for many of the labourers in his father's line of work. To find the shillings he had put aside what he could from a job or two of tailoring in the early summer, and he had taken, or had asked his mother to give, a piece of the housekeeping money that Mrs. Youngman had been keeping in her tin on the mantel at Manor Place. She had given it without a great deal of question. He had told her it was for the wedding, and in her mind a wedding covered a good many outgoings that she did not have the head to inquire into. She was a woman of her time. She did not read her son's letters at the office on the Strand. She did not know the sum. She did not know the life on which it had been settled. Let me try to make you feel the weight of the figure once more, because I think the ear glances off it. £100 in that summer would have paid the rent on a decent set of 3 rooms in a respectable part of Camberwell for the best part of 4 years. It would have bought a horse and a cart together, with the harness thrown in. It would have covered the outfit and passage of a family of 4 to New South Wales. It would have kept a widow in coal and bread and tea for a decade. In the world William inhabited, of shillings and half-crowns and rent marked off in a landlady's book with a wetted pencil, £100 was not a sum of money. It was a change in the weather of a life. And it was now settled, in a locked cupboard on the Strand, on the life of a girl who did not know it existed. The clerk handed him the little square of stiff paper across the counter. He looked at it for a moment. He folded it in half, and again in quarters, and slid it into his inner pocket. He said good day. He put on his hat. He went out into the noise of the Strand. I want you to sit with the plainness of that transaction for one more moment before we leave the office. There was no shout, no ceremony, no ringing of a bell. A young man in a threadbare coat had bought, over a mahogany counter, for 22 shillings, the right to receive £100 when a healthy young woman of 19 should happen to die. In the ordinary run of the world, such a right would sit in his pocket for 40 years and never be called upon. She would outlive him. The clerk would go into his grave with her still walking the earth. Old age would find her at a kitchen table in Camberwell or Peckham, with grandchildren pulling at her sleeve, and the yellowing paper in a drawer would be forgotten. In the ordinary run of the world, he walked back over the river with the paper in his pocket and crossed the bridge in the late afternoon light. Southward through the borough he went, past the tanneries whose smell always hung about that quarter, past the hop warehouses of Southwark, with their tall shuttered doors, past the corner of the New Kent Road, where an old blind fiddler stood every day of that summer for the coppers of the passing trade. On into Newington he went, and along the Walworth Road, and turned into the streets of terraces behind it, and came at length to a door he had known all his life, in a street called Manor Place, where his mother was expecting him for tea, and where a country girl he was to marry, on the coming Sunday, was sitting at the kitchen table, teaching his 2 young brothers a rhyme she had learned as a child in Sussex. He put his hand to the latch, drew a breath on the step, and went in. The house on Manor Place. Come south with me now, back over the river and out from under the coal smoke of the Strand, down through the traffic on the bridge, and into the streets on the Newington side of the water. It is the last Monday evening in July of 1860. The sun has gone off the roofs of Camberwell, and is drawing the shadows of the chimneys out across the pavements. This is the hour when the working streets of Walworth begin to settle for the night. Manor Place ran off the Walworth Road in the parish of Newington, on the eastern side, and was reached by a turning between a chandler's shop and a chapel. The houses stood in 2 rows facing each other across a narrow way that was cobbled in the middle and flagged at the sides. They had been put up perhaps 30 years before, in the flat brick style of that decade, with 3 windows across the front and 2 floors of rooms above the door. Each had a strip of area at the pavement with iron railings, and a set of steps going down to a basement kitchen. The rents were within reach of a working family who wanted the address of a proper street and not a court. Number 16 sat about halfway along the row. I have stood in the ground that has taken its place. The old houses of Manor Place are gone. The parish came through with fresh building later in the century, and the last war did the rest, and the road as it now stands would be as strange to Mrs. Youngman as her own street would be to us. Something else takes up the ground. It is easy to find, and it is worth almost nothing to look at. Come inside instead, before the houses came down, on that Monday evening in that July. The door of number 16 was of common deal, painted a dull green, with a brass knocker rubbed to a shine by the hand of Mrs. Youngman herself. Inside was a passage of 2 paces, floored with a length of oilcloth. Off the passage to the right lay the front room where the family lived and ate, and, most nights, slept. Beyond the passage the stairs went up between 2 walls. Beyond the stairs was a back kitchen with a range in it and a copper for the wash. Under the whole ran a basement with a coal cellar and a scullery where the mangle stood. Above the front room was a bedchamber that faced the street, and behind it a box room with a skylight. In the whole of that house there were 4 chambers fit to sleep in, and on that Monday evening they held 5 people. Mrs. Youngman was a widow, in fact, if not on paper. Her husband was alive. He was a working man who took the jobs that were going, and was often out of the parish for a week at a time on his labour. That week he was not at Manor Place. Where he was exactly, the record does not agree upon. One paper had him at a piece of building work east of the river. Another had him lodged with a brother at Deptford. He was not in the house that Monday evening, and he was not expected in it, and Mrs. Youngman had turned the front bedchamber over in her mind to the accommodation of her guest. She was in her middle 40s. The parish register at Newington gives her age at burial as 44, though there is a note in the margin that suggests it may have been a year or 2 more, for the ages of working women in that decade were often set down as they were guessed and not as they were known. She was a spare woman, brown-haired, going grey at the temples, with hands that had washed for other households the best part of 30 years. She had borne 4 sons. The eldest was William, who was 25 that summer and lodging over the river. The 2 youngest were still with her. They were her comfort and her work. The elder was 7 years old, or thereabouts, and had lately started at a school on the New Kent Road where the pence went in on a Monday morning, wrapped in a scrap of paper. The younger was 5, and was in the last of his infancy, with his hair still uncut at the back. Both were thin and quick, as the sons of a labouring woman in that district tended to be. They ran without their boots in the house, and put them on to go into the street. We do not know what Mrs. Youngman gave the household to eat that evening. Nobody wrote it down. I have looked through the inquest depositions, and the household purchases were not gone into. I can tell you, from other Walworth households of that year, what would likely have been on the table. She would have set out a loaf, bought that morning from the baker on the corner of Amelia Street for 4pence halfpenny. There would have been a piece of cold bacon that she had boiled on the Sunday, sliced now in thin rounds. There would have been a plate of pickled cabbage from a stone jar in the scullery, and a bit of cheese for the 2 boys, and tea in a brown pot with a chipped spout. Whether William took his tea at that table with the rest of them, or came in afterwards from the street, is one of the details nobody was ever asked. He was there for part of the evening. That much is certain. Mary Streeter had by then been in the house for the best part of 3 days. She had come to Manor Place from London Bridge Station on the previous Friday, and she had been received at the door by Mrs. Youngman with the reserved kindness of an older woman who had made up her mind to think well of the girl her son was to marry. Mary had slept on Friday and Saturday and Sunday night in the front bedchamber above the parlour. Mrs. Youngman had made up the bed in there fresh for her. She had put out a jug and a basin on the washstand, and a fresh piece of yellow soap that she could ill afford, and a length of toweling that she had washed and ironed herself. Mary had thanked her. Mary had asked, on the first evening, whether she might help with the tea things, and Mrs. Youngman had said no, it was her holiday, and had shooed her out of the kitchen. The 2 women had grown more at ease with each other over the Saturday and the Sunday, in the way that 2 women in a house will do when the days go by and nothing frightful happens. Mrs. Youngman had shown her the length of dark blue merino that William had bought for the wedding gown, and had helped her to lay it out on the parlour table and to pin the paper pattern to it. On the Sunday afternoon they had walked together with the 2 boys to a service at St. Peter's, and had stopped afterwards at a coffee stall on the way home for a mug of coffee at a penny each. The elder boy had held Mary's hand for the walk back, and had told her a long story about a horse he had seen on the New Kent Road. She had laughed in all the right places. The younger had gone to sleep on his mother's shoulder, before they reached their own door. You have to hold on to those 3 days, because they are the whole of the acquaintance. Mary was in that house from the Friday to the Monday. In the span of her life, in and among Mrs. Youngman and the 2 boys, she had 4 days and 3 nights. She was fond of them by the time the Monday came round. I have to say it plainly. The letters she wrote to her mother that weekend, one on the Sunday afternoon at the parlour table, one on the Monday morning, have both survived, and they are in the file at Kew. They are the letters of a girl who is being made welcome. She writes that Mrs. Youngman is very good to her, that the little boys are as merry as sparrows, and that William has been out about their business a good deal, but has been kind whenever he has been in. Where, in the middle of all this, was William? That is the question a listener in a bed today wants to ask, and I want to answer it as far as the record allows. He was in and out of the house from Friday to Monday, without a great pattern to it. He came for meals. He had slept for one of the nights at Manor Place, on a made-up bed in the back kitchen, and on 2 of the nights he had gone back over the river to Wellington Terrace. On the Sunday night, by his mother's later evidence at the inquest, he came in about 10 and went straight up the stairs, and was in the house from that hour onward. By the Monday morning he was, to the eye of everyone under that roof, as much a resident of number 16 as his mother and the boys. He moved about the rooms of that house, as a young man moves through the house he has grown up in, that is to say, without knocking on doors. Up the stairs he went, and down them again without a footfall Mrs. Youngman would have remarked upon. He passed his mother in the passage and touched her shoulder as he went by. He set his hat on the peg by the door, and took it down again half an hour later. Up from the cellar he carried a bucket of coal for the parlour fire. He sat for 10 minutes at the table with the elder boy on his knee, and taught him a rhyme about a mouse in a mill. Out into the Walworth Road he went after tea, and came back within the hour with a paper twist of humbugs from a shop on the corner, which he divided between the 2 boys, and pressed one into Mary's palm as well. 2 or 3 times across the Monday afternoon, one of the neighbours saw him at the door. The women of that street sat out on the step of an evening for the air, and a young man coming and going from number 16 was a thing they would notice and would tuck away in their heads without any particular meaning attached to it at the time. What his errands were on the Monday, on his 2nd and 3rd trips out of the house, has never been established. One newspaper had it that he went as far as the Strand and returned. Another had him no further than the New Cut and a public house there where he was known by sight. The evidence at the trial did not settle it. He was seen at the door of the house at various hours between the middle of the afternoon and about 9 at night, coming in or going out, always by himself. You have to picture the last of that Monday, then, in the 2 chambers of that house that mattered. Downstairs in the front parlour, Mrs. Youngman was at the deal table finishing off the ironing that she had begun in the morning. The flat iron sat on a folded cloth. The kettle was on the trivet at the fire. Her elder boy was on the rug at her feet with a wooden horse he had made himself out of 2 clothes pegs and a scrap of leather. The younger was already in bed on the far side of the room, in the bedstead that Mrs. Youngman and the 2 boys shared, with his face turned to the wall and one thumb in his mouth. The window was open at the top for the heat, and a draught came in over the sill and lifted the corner of the tablecloth. Up the stairs, in the front bedchamber above the parlour, Mary Streeter was making ready to go to bed. She had washed her face at the basin. She had let down her hair and had combed it out for its 100 strokes, as her mother in Wadhurst had taught her to do. She had said her prayers at the side of the bed as she said them every night, on her knees, with her elbows on the coverlet and her forehead resting against her folded hands. She had prayed for her father and her mother in Sussex, and for her sister at home, and for Mrs. Youngman below, and for the 2 boys, and for William, and for herself. She had asked, as she had asked every night for a fortnight, that she might be a good wife. Somewhere between the 2 of them, at about 10:15 by the parlour clock, William Godfrey Youngman came down from the box-room at the back, where he had gone to lie for an hour with his coat still on. He had a candle in one hand. He was in his shirt-sleeves. His footfall on the treads was even. Mrs. Youngman heard him from the parlour and did not look up. The clock ticked on the mantel. The kettle sighed on the trivet. In the chamber above, Mary set her comb down on the washstand and blew out her own candle and lay between the coarse, clean sheets of the front bed. Below, Mrs. Youngman set the flat iron aside, banked the fire down for the night, kissed the sleeping face of the child in the bed, and drew the elder boy out from under the table and lifted him in beside his brother. She took off her cap and her gown and her stays. Her own short prayer, she said, at the side of the bed. She got in beside her sons and drew the sheet up over the three of them. Somewhere in the passage, between the parlour door and the foot of the stairs, a young man with a candle in one hand paused a moment. His shadow stretched up the wall of the staircase and out across the ceiling of the little hall. He blew the candle out. The house came down into darkness, room by room, as the houses in that street were coming down into darkness on either side of it. A cart went by in the Walworth Road, and its wheels rang on the granite setts and were gone. A dog barked once, 3 streets away, and did not bark again. In the front bed of the parlour, a mother and her 2 sons breathed together in the steady way that sleeping people breathe. In the front bedchamber above, a country girl of 19 turned once on her pillow and settled. And on the second stair from the top, in the dark, a hand reached out and laid itself flat against the wall for balance, and waited and listened. The knife on the stairs. Stay with me for this hour. I am going to keep the light very low. What happens in the house on Manor Place between the last stroke of the parlour clock and the first grey of the summer morning is the quiet centre of the whole story, and I would rather you heard it as though it were being told to you in a room 3 streets away, at a table, with the tea being poured, than as though you were being led up those stairs yourself. You are not in that house. You have never been in that house. You are in your own bed, and the door of that bed is shut, and you are listening only. The clock in the parlour of number 16 was of the plain kind that a woman in Mrs. Youngman's line of life could just about afford. It had a face of painted tin and a short brass pendulum, and it stood on the mantel-shelf above the range where the kettle had sung earlier in the evening. Its tick carried through the wall to the passage. It struck the hour with one thin note that stopped short of a chime. At about 11:15, by the reckoning that was put together afterwards from the neighbours and from the constable's own watch, the fire in the parlour range had burned down to a red bed of ash. The kettle had been drawn off the trivet. The flat iron sat cool on its folded cloth. Both candles in the parlour had been blown out. A single candle stub burned on the washstand of the front chamber upstairs, and that was the last flame alight in the whole of the house. Downstairs in the front room, on the wide, low bed the 3 of them shared, Mrs. Youngman lay on the outside, with her elder boy tucked in against her ribs, and the younger boy on the far side of him, against the wall. She had drawn the sheet up as high as their shoulders against the cool that came in over the window sill after midnight. Her arm lay across the coverlet with the palm turned up. She was, by the medical evidence given later, deeply asleep. The elder boy slept with one leg thrown out of the sheet in the way children do in a warm July. The younger, 5 years old, slept with his thumb in his mouth and his face pressed into the pillow. The 3 of them breathed together in the slow rhythm of the middle of the night. Above them, in the front chamber over the parlour, Mary Wells Streeter lay in the bed that Mrs. Youngman had made up so carefully on the Friday. Her hair had been plaited for the night in one long rope down her back. The candle on her washstand had gone down almost to the socket, and its flame had drawn itself into a yellow bead that gave no light beyond a foot from the wick. Her breathing was steady. Her hands were folded, in the way of country girls who had been taught to sleep as they had knelt to say their prayers, in the middle of her chest above the coverlet. I want to tell you something plain about what was in the house that night, because it matters for what follows, and because the record is very clear about it. William Godfrey Youngman had brought a knife with him to Manor Place. He had brought it, by the evidence that came out at the trial, from Wellington Terrace, folded into a piece of leather, in the inner pocket of the same coat he had hung on the peg by the door on the Sunday evening. The knife itself was of the sort a shoemaker would use for paring leather. Its blade was short, perhaps 3 inches, curved a little at the point, and ground on both edges to a working sharpness. Its handle was of horn, dark with age and the sweat of another man's hand, tied with a wrap of waxed thread near the tang. Where he had come by it, whether from his father's trade or from a stall he had passed on the new cut, was not established at the trial, and I will not invent a source for it now. The knife was in the house. That is what matters. It had been in the house since Sunday night. Where the knife had lain in the house across the Monday, we do not know. The prosecution did not press for it, and no witness had seen it. It may have been in the coat pocket still. It may have been laid on the sill of the box room at the back, where William had gone to lie for an hour after tea. It may have been slipped, at some point in the long evening, under the mattress of the bed made up for him in the back kitchen. Somewhere, in one of the little places a young man knows in the house of his childhood, the knife had waited through the wash-up and through the ironing and through Mary's 100 strokes of her comb, and had come into his hand at last on the darkened landing at the top of the stairs. He went to the front chamber first. That is the plain fact of it, and it is the fact that the surgeon's evidence at the inquest bore out. The door of that chamber had no lock on the inside. Country girls in the service of Sussex farmhouses did not think to ask for a lock on their door when they came into a family house in the city, and Mary had not asked for one. He pushed the door with the flat of his hand. It gave without a sound. The floorboards of the chamber were covered by a piece of drugget that Mrs. Youngman had beaten out on the Saturday morning, and his footfall on it made no report. The candle stub on the washstand went out from the draught of the opening door, and the chamber came into full dark. He knew the room. He had slept in it many times as a boy. He crossed to the bed. I am not going to tell you what he did. The surgeon at the inquest told the coroner and the jury in the careful language of his trade, and the reporters at the papers wrote it down in the careful language of theirs, and the record is there to be read for those who need to read it. It was quick. The medical evidence was clear on that point. Mary Wells Streeter, a country girl of 19 who had said her prayers on her knees an hour before, did not wake in the ordinary sense of the word. There was a start of the body against the sheet, and a hand raised for a moment as if against a low branch across a path, and then no more. She would have known very little. That is the one mercy the record allows in the whole of this night, and I will let it stand. He came back out of the chamber. The stair carried him down. Halfway down he stopped, and stood for what may have been half a minute or a minute together, at the turn of the staircase, with his hand against the wall as he had stood earlier on the top step. What he was doing there we cannot know. Some men in the writing of this case afterwards said he was listening for whether the sound had carried through the floor. Others said he was steadying himself. I would not swear to either. He came on down. The parlour door was ajar. It always was in that house at night, so that Mrs. Youngman could hear from her bed if the younger boy called out for water. He pushed it open with his shoulder. He went into the front room. The fire in the range gave off a low glow that showed the edge of the table, and the flat iron on its cloth, and the shape of the wide bed at the far wall. 3 heads on 1 pillow. An arm across the coverlet. A foot out of the sheet. Again, I will not walk you through the detail. Mrs. Youngman was killed first, on the outside of the bed, and did not wake. The elder boy, 7 years old, who had held Mary's hand on the walk back from St. Peter's the day before, may have opened his eyes for a moment. The surgeon thought it likely, from the position of a hand against the pillow, that he had. He would have seen very little. The room was almost dark. His mother was already gone, and he did not have a mother's word to call out for. He went next. The younger boy, 5 years old, with his thumb still in his mouth, did not wake at all. He was the last of the 3. It was over, in that front room, in less time than it takes the parlour clock to strike the quarter. The kettle sat on the trivet. The flat iron sat on its cloth. The wooden horse of 2 clothes pegs lay on the rug where the elder boy had left it. Nothing else in the room had been disturbed. He came out of the parlour. He stood for a while in the passage. The oilcloth was cold under his feet, and he was in his stockings, having taken his shoes off at some point in the last hour of the evening on the landing above. His shirt was wet at the front and at both cuffs. His hands were wet. He walked down the passage to the back kitchen. He drew a basin of water from the copper, which was still faintly warm from the Monday morning's wash, and he set the basin on the deal table there, and he rinsed his hands in it. The water clouded at once, and he did not change it. He rinsed his face. He dried it on the roller towel that hung on the back of the kitchen door. The shirt he left as it was. There would not have been time, and I do not think it entered his head at that moment, to change it. He went back through the passage to the front room. He looked in from the doorway. The fire had sunk a little more. The bed at the far wall was very still. He did not go in again. He turned. He went up the stairs. He stopped at the front chamber above and looked in once from the door without crossing the threshold. He did not go in there either. He went along the little landing to the box room at the back where he had lain earlier in the evening. He lay down on the made-up bed there, in his shirt and his trousers and his stockings, with the shoemaker's knife on the boards of the floor beside him, and he closed his eyes. Whether he slept in the 2 hours that followed, no one can honestly tell you. The doctors at the trial were asked. They would not commit themselves. A young man in that state may lie for an hour in what looks like sleep and remember none of it. He may lie for an hour with his eyes shut and every thought moving in his head like carts over cobbles. What we know is that he did not leave the house. The front door of number 16 stayed on its latch. The back door, into the yard behind the scullery, was found bolted in the morning from the inside. He was still on that made-up bed in the box room when the constable came up the stairs. The house, in those 2 hours, went on being itself. The parlour clock kept its tick. The fire in the range shifted once and settled, and shifted again, in the collapses that a coal fire makes as it dies. The kettle cooled on the trivet. A moth that had come in earlier at the parlour window found the last curl of warmth over the flat iron and settled on the cloth beside it. In the chamber above, the candle stub had long gone out. In the front room below, the wide bed lay in its shadow at the far wall. Outside, in the Walworth Road, the last of the traffic had gone. A single hackney cab passed the top of Manor Place at about 12:30. The driver was on his way home from a fair at Kennington, and would tell an inspector 3 days later that he had seen no light in any of the front windows of the terrace as he passed. A dog barked 4 streets away toward the Elephant, and was quiet. The bells of St. Peter's did not ring the middle of the night. The bell of the Newington workhouse did. Its single stroke at 1 o'clock carried across the roofs of the parish, and into every room of every house that had its window open for the heat. In number 16, no one heard it. Somewhere on the far side of the party wall, though, in the front bedchamber of number 17, a woman who had slept badly all summer stirred in her bed. She had heard, or half heard, a sound she could not put a name to. It was not the sound of a cart. It was not the sound of a dog. She listened, in the way a person listens who is not yet awake, with the coverlet drawn up under her chin, and after a little while she thought no more of it, and turned on her pillow, and went back down into her sleep. It was the first thread that would be pulled, at breakfast the next morning, into the long unravelling of the case. The parlour clock struck 2. In the box room at the back of number 16, the young man on the made-up bed lay very still. In the passage below him, the shadow of the banister moved slowly across the oilcloth, as the moon of that hot July came round to the fanlight over the door. The house held its breath, and in the darkness before the first grey of the summer morning brought a milk cart into the Walworth Road, and a neighbour out onto her step. The night at Manor Place began, at last, to turn toward its dawn. The cry heard through the wall. The morning came into Manor Place by degrees, the way a summer morning comes into a working street in July. The sky went from black to a thin blue over the roofs of Camberwell at about 3:45. A blackbird started up in the yard of St. Peter's, and was answered from the copper gutter above number 17. A cart passed the top of the road at the hour and was gone, its driver singing to himself a rag of a song about a girl in Islington. On both sides of the terrace the sleepers turned in their beds and slept on. I want you to stay next door for a little while now, in the house against the party wall. Number 17 was not much different from its neighbour in the way it stood. Its passage lay on the mirror side, its parlour on the right instead of the left, and its front chamber over the parlour looked out over the same iron railings and the same length of cobble. The wall between the 2 houses was of the thin kind a landlord had put up in a hurry when the terrace was new. A woman sitting up in her bed in the one, if she paid attention, could hear a chair being drawn out at a table in the other. The woman who lived in that front chamber was, by the papers, Mrs. Beard. One of the reporters set her name down as Bevan, and I have never quite worked out which of them was right. Either way, she was a widow of about 50 years who took in plain sewing and lived with a married daughter in the back room. She had slept badly all that summer with the heat, and had learned to lie awake for an hour or two in the middle of the night without troubling herself about it. At about 3 o'clock, by her own later account at the inquest, she stirred. She could not, when the coroner pressed her, name what had brought her up out of her sleep. It was not a cry, she said. It was not a voice she had heard. It was more a rap, one single rap, of the sort a piece of firewood makes as it settles in a grate. Then, after it, a scuffle of feet on boards, in the way a person might cross a chamber in stockinged feet. Then no more. She listened for a little, in the way you listen when you are half awake, with the sheet drawn up under your chin. She thought of getting up. She did not get up. She turned on the pillow, and after a little while she went back down into her sleep. You have to hold on to that hour. It is the one moment in the whole night when the wall between the two houses might have been made to speak, and it did not. There is no blame in it. The record of what a working woman with a bad summer's heat has heard through a party wall at 3 in the morning is thin ground for any judgment, and I am not going to judge her here. She heard what she heard. She went back to sleep. In the morning she would remember it, and she would say so, and the case would turn on her memory as much as on any piece of evidence in it. The house next to hers, meanwhile, kept its silence. The fire in the parlour range had gone right down to ash. The kettle sat cool on the trivet. In the front bed of that parlour, the wide, low bed the three of them had shared, 3 sleepers lay in the shadow of the far wall and did not stir. In the chamber above, a country girl of 19 lay on her side with her plait down her back and did not stir either. In the box room at the back, on the made-up bed, William Godfrey Youngman lay in his shirt and his trousers, with his shoes off, and one hand thrown out across the coverlet. Whether he had slept in the last 2 hours, no one could ever say for certain. He would give one account of it at the inquest, and another at the trial, and neither account agreed with the medical evidence about the state of a man's dress at that hour of the morning. I do not think it matters greatly, and I would not have you lie awake in your bed and try to work it out. He was there. He was in the house. He had not left the house. That was the fact that would matter. The street began to come back to itself at about 4:30. A milkman came up from the yard at Kennington with his cans slung from a wooden yoke, and stopped at every second door along the terrace to leave a measure in the jug that had been set out on the step the night before. He did not stop at number 16. There had been no jug at that step for a week, Mrs. Youngman having made her own arrangement with a dairy on the Walworth Road that saved her a farthing on the pint. He passed on. He would remember, days afterwards, that the front curtain of number 16 had been drawn to the sill and that no light burned behind it, and would say so at the inquest, and would think about it for the rest of his life. Come to the doorstep with me now. It is about 5:15. The sun has come off the tops of the chimneys on the west side of Manor Place, and is starting to draw the shadows of the pots back down the tiles. A man of 50 or so, in a leather apron over his shirt, has come out of the door of number 17 to sluice the step with a pail of water. This is Mr. Beard. He is a shoemender by trade, and he has a set of stools and a bench inside the passage of his house where he takes in work. He sets down the pail. He looks up the street toward the Walworth Road. He looks the other way, toward the chapel. His eye comes back, in the way an eye will, to the door beside his own. There is a mark on the step of number 16. It runs from the edge of the flags, under the door, and out into the joint of the 2 lower panels. It is not water, and it is not the slop from a chamber pot, though at that hour a man on a doorstep might mistake it for either. Mr. Beard bends his knees a little and looks again. He straightens. He looks at his own hand. He calls, in a level voice that does not carry very far, to his daughter in the passage behind him. He tells her to fetch a constable from the beat on the Walworth Road, and to be quick about it, and not to say a word to a soul as she goes. The daughter goes. She is barefoot, and her hair is still in the rag curlers she had put in the night before. She runs the length of Manor Place with her apron held up at the knee. At the corner by the chapel she meets a constable of P Division on the return leg of his beat, coming down toward the terrace, and takes him by the sleeve. What she says to him the record does not preserve. What he heard was enough to make him quicken his stride, and to draw his rattle from his belt as he came along the pavement toward number 16. He did not spring it. There would be no shouting in the street. He came up to the step at a fast walk and put his hand on the door. I would not want to give you the constable's name with more confidence than the papers themselves showed. One had him down as Varney and another as Barney, and a third simply as an officer of P Division whose number was not given at first. What we know of him from the record is that he was a man of about 30, in the second year of his beat in that district, and that his daughter would say of him, 60 years afterwards, that he never took an evening drink in his life, and that he had never spoken at home of what he saw that morning. He pushed the door with the flat of his hand. It gave. Whether the bolt had been drawn back in the night by the man inside, or whether the latch had not caught after his last coming and going the evening before, we cannot honestly say. The door gave, and it opened onto the passage. Mr. Beard came up behind him on the step. The two men stood together for a moment. The passage inside was in shadow, the fanlight over the door being a poor thing, and the parlour door being pushed to. The oilcloth of the floor was scuffed toward the foot of the stairs. There was a mark on the 3rd stair up. There was another on the 5th. The constable went in. Mr. Beard was told, in the same level voice, to stay on the step and to let no man pass him. He obeyed. The constable pushed the parlour door with his shoulder. It swung. I am going to keep this at a hand's distance from you, in the same way I did an hour before. You have not been taken into that room in this telling, and I am not going to take you into it now. The constable stood at the door and looked. He did not go further. What he saw at the far wall he would tell the coroner about in the language his trade had taught him for such reports, and what he thought of it he would keep behind his teeth for the rest of his life. He turned. He came out. He pushed the parlour door to behind him and set his back against it for a moment on the passage side, with his eyes closed. Then he opened them, and he looked up the stairs. There is a thing that is said about the officers of P Division in that year, and it is one of the few things about this case that comes down to us in the words of the men themselves. They said, in the years afterwards, when they were older and were sitting on stools in the section houses talking to the younger ones coming up, that the worst of the beat was not the drunks in the courts off the New Cut, and it was not the river dead pulled out at Waterloo Stairs, and it was not the fires at the works by the canal. The worst of the beat, they would say, was a house in Manor Place in the July of the year 1860, and a passage with an oilcloth floor, and a mark on the 3rd stair. The constable put his hand on the banister. He set his boot on the 1st tread. The stair creaked at the 2nd, in the way that stair had always creaked, though no one in the house had thought of that until now. Behind him, on the step, Mr. Beard had turned and was speaking to 2 other men who had come up out of the terrace, a labourer from number 19, and a coalman from further along, telling them in a level voice that they were not to come in. Above him, on the landing at the top of the stairs, a door stood a little open on the front chamber. Beyond it, at the back of the landing, another door stood shut on the box room. He climbed. The rest of the terrace, on both sides, was coming awake now. Windows were pushed up. A woman in a cap looked out and drew her head in again. Somewhere on the Walworth Road, further down toward the Elephant, a rattle was sprung at last, in the way the men of the division sprang it when they wanted the sergeant fetched from the station house at Kennington Lane. The sound of it carried up over the roofs of Newington and rolled off toward the river. In number 17, the woman who had heard the single rap in the middle of the night sat up in her bed and put her hand to her mouth and knew what she had heard. The constable reached the top of the stairs. He stood a moment on the landing. He looked at the front chamber, with its door standing a little open, and did not go in. He turned instead to the box room at the back, and put his hand on that handle, and pushed the door. It opened without resistance. On the made-up bed inside, a young man of about 25 was sitting upright with his back against the wall and his hands laid flat on the coverlet in front of him. His shirt was wet at the front and at both cuffs. His face was without expression. He looked at the constable. He drew a breath. He began to speak. The arrest in the bloodied shirt. He drew a breath, and he said that his father had done it. That was the first thing the constable heard from him in the box room at the back of number 16. It was said in a level voice, without heat, and with the small tremor a man might have who has been sitting up for a little while against a cold wall. His father had come to the house in the night. His father had gone into the front room. His father had gone into the chamber above. His father had come out onto the landing and had struck at him too as he lay on the box-room bed, and he had taken the knife from him at last on the stairs, and his father had gone away out of the back scullery, and he did not know now where his father had gone. Come and stand with me by the box-room door for a moment. I do not want you to look past me into the room. I only want you to hear what he said, and to hear the plainness of the way he said it. The papers of the week that followed would print his words in italics and in double quotation marks, as though they had been spoken from a stage, and it is easy after all these years to imagine that they were said with a shudder or a flourish. They were not. Every officer who spoke of it afterwards was clear on that point. He sat on the coverlet with his palms laid flat, and he told a story about his father, and his voice did not lift. The constable did not answer him at first. He looked at the shirt. He looked at the hands laid flat. He looked, without meaning to, at the boards on the floor by the head of the bed, where the shoemaker's knife lay in the shadow of the sheet. He said, in the level way of a man of his trade, that Mr. Youngman was to come down the stairs with him, if he pleased. He did not say why. There were forms of speech that the men of the division kept for a house of that sort at that hour, and the least word said was the best. He put out his hand to the elbow of the young man's shirt sleeve, and the young man got up off the bed, and stood in his stockinged feet, and came out of the box-room onto the landing without any resistance at all. They went down the stairs together. The constable was in front, one hand on the banister, one hand at the sleeve. Halfway down, the young man stumbled a little on the turn of the stair, and the constable steadied him without a word. The parlour door at the foot of the passage was pushed to, in the way the constable had left it. He did not open it now. He led the young man past it and out onto the step, and there in the doorway Mr. Beard drew back to make room for them and did not speak, and the two men who had come up from the terrace to stand behind Mr. Beard drew back too, and put their hands in their pockets, and looked at the pavement. I would like you to see the street at this hour, because it is not the London that we carry in our heads when we think of a case like this one. It is nearly 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in July. The sun is well up over the roofs on the west side of Manor Place, and the shadows on the cobbles are drawn out long toward the chapel wall. A milk cart is at the far end of the terrace, its horse still in the shafts, and its cans set on the paving beside it. A woman in a white apron has come out of number 19, and is standing on her step with both hands to her cheeks, saying nothing. 3 or 4 children of the terrace, who have got themselves out of bed at the noise of the rattle springing on the Walworth road, are lined along the railings with their chins on the iron. No one has yet raised a voice. That would come later, and it would come from the further end of the street, when a woman who had known Mrs. Youngman since the christening of her elder boy came round the corner with her basket over her arm and saw the constable at the door. The rattle springing had brought 2 more officers up from the beat within a few minutes, and by the time Youngman was on the step, there was a sergeant of the division as well, who had been fetched from a public house on the Kennington Road, where he had been standing his supper. The sergeant took charge quietly. He put a hand on the young man's shoulder from the other side, and the constable let the sleeve of the shirt go, and the two of them together, sergeant on the one side and constable on the other, walked Youngman down the length of Manor Place, toward the corner by the chapel. He was not put in irons. That is worth saying, because a modern ear reaches for the picture of chains at once, and the picture is wrong. The practice of the division in that year, in the case of a man taken from a house in his shirt and his stockings, was to walk him between 2 officers with a firm hand at each elbow. He walked so. His feet on the cobbles made a soft padded sound, and one of the children at the railings laughed at it, because a child at 7 years old will laugh at a grown man walking in his stockings in the street, and does not know yet that there is anything else in the world to look at. They turned the corner by the chapel, and they came out into the Walworth Road. Here the street was awake. Costermongers' barrows were being pushed down from the yards behind the New Kent Road. A boy with a tray of muffins on his head was going up from the Elephant. A grey horse harnessed to a brewer's dray stood at the curb outside a public house whose shutters had not yet been taken down. Heads turned. A man in a leather apron stepped out from a doorway with a broom in his hand and stood watching. A woman in a lace cap crossed herself. Nobody spoke. In the Walworth Road, in the morning of that Tuesday, the passing of a young man in a wet shirt between two officers of the division was a thing that the whole length of the street stopped for and did not comment on. "Stay with me. We will walk with them as far as the station house, and then I will let them go in without us. It is not so very far." The route the sergeant took, by the officer's own account at the inquest, was up the Walworth Road as far as the crossing at the New Kent Road, and then a little west along the New Kent Road, and then in by the door of the station house of the P Division at the corner of what was then Trafalgar Street, and is not called by that name any longer. It is perhaps 3/4 of a mile. It took them, walking as they were, about 20 minutes. Youngman said nothing on the walk. The constable would remember, at the trial, that he had asked once at the crossing whether he might have his shoes. The sergeant had answered that his shoes would be sent for. He had said very well, and had walked on. At the station house door the desk sergeant looked up from his book and understood at once, and did not ask a question. There was a form of receiving a man in that division that did not require questions in the front room. The two officers took Youngman past the desk and along a short passage to a whitewashed room at the back that the men of the division used for the search of a prisoner. There was a table in it, and a chair, and a hook on the wall, and a small iron stove that had not been lit that morning. The window was high in the wall and gave on to a yard. The floor was of scrubbed board. He was told to stand by the table. He was told to put his hands on the wood of it, palms down, and to keep them so. He did. The sergeant took a slate from a shelf and began to write on it in chalk. The constable stood at the door. Another officer, whom the papers would afterwards call a gaoler, came in with a length of clean sheeting over his arm and set it on the corner of the table. I want to keep the plain fact of what came next quite clear, because it is the point of the chapter and the point of the day. He was asked to take off his shirt. He did so, without a word, over his head, and laid it on the wood of the table where the sergeant had cleared a space for it. His undervest was taken off and laid beside it. His stockings were taken from his feet and set at the corner. The waistband of his trousers was examined, and the trousers were taken from him too, and folded and set with the rest. He stood in the whitewashed room in nothing but a length of the clean sheeting the gaoler had wrapped about his hips, and he was given a mug of water, and he drank from it, and he set it back on the table, and he did not speak. Every one of those garments went, in the same hour, into a wooden box that the desk sergeant had marked with chalk on the lid, and the box went into the strong room at the end of the passage, and the key of the strong room was drawn out of the lock and put onto the sergeant's ring. In the days and weeks that followed, that box would be brought out again to be looked at, by the surgeon who had spoken at the inquest, and by the coroner's officer, and at last by the counsel who would prosecute the case at the Central Criminal Court. The shirt would be held up in a courtroom in front of a jury, in the plain daylight of an August morning, and the wet at the front of it, which had by then dried into a dark and irregular stain across the whole of the breast and both cuffs, would be shown to 12 men of London and to a judge in a wig, and would not be forgotten by any of them. That was still to come. In the whitewashed room at the back of the station house, on the Tuesday morning of the 31st of July, 1860, it was only a shirt on a table, being folded by a gaoler in a leather apron, who did not look at it more than he had to. "Come away from the door with me now, and let the men of the division get on with their morning. I do not want you to hear the rest." The record from that point onward is of a kind the station book kept in its own language, and no good comes of dwelling on it in ours. Youngman was given other clothing, of the sort the division kept for a man taken from a house without his coat, and he was set in a cell at the end of the passage, and a constable was put on the bench outside the cell door, with instructions to speak to him only if he spoke first. He did not speak first. He asked, at about 8 o'clock, for tea, and was given tea. He asked, at about 9, for a piece of bread, and was given bread. He asked, at about 10, whether his father had been found, and was told that inquiries were being made. Between whiles he sat on the wooden pallet inside the cell with his back to the wall, and he looked at nothing in particular, and he did not sleep. His father, of course, had not been in Manor Place that night. His father, a tailor by trade, kept a room in a house on the far side of the river, and had gone to bed there on the Monday evening after his supper, and had been seen going to bed by the landlady's daughter, and had come out of it in the morning at his usual hour. He was found by an officer of the division at about 11 o'clock, at his own board, with a piece of grey worsted across his knee and a needle in his hand, and was told what had happened, and did not for some minutes seem able to take it in. He was brought back across the river in a cab, and he was set in a room at the station house, and asked what he could tell of the night, and he told the plain truth of it, and every word of what he told was borne out at once by the landlady and by her daughter, and by a lodger on the same floor. By noon of that Tuesday, the story the young man had told in the box-room was already coming apart in the officer's hands. There is a thing I ought to say plainly here, because we do not always say it in a case like this one. The record does not tell us what the father, sitting in that room at the station house, thought of his son in the hour that followed. Whether he wept or whether he was silent was not written down. One of the officers said long afterwards that he had put his face into his hands for a long time and had said nothing. Another had no memory of it at all. I would not push either account too far. The private grief of a plain working tailor of Newington, whose son had done what the officers were beginning to know his son had done, was not a thing that the papers of the week were interested in, and was not a thing the trial would touch. It was left alone. By the middle of the afternoon, a covered cart had come to Manor Place from the parish, and the 4 who had been in the house through the night were taken away in it, wrapped in sheeting, one at a time, and set down at the dead house behind the Newington workhouse to await the coroner. The door of number 16 was locked with a key that had been in Mrs. Youngman's own pocket, and the key was given to a constable on the step, and the constable was set on the step to keep the terrace off until the sergeant came again. Mr. Beard, next door, took off his leather apron and hung it on its peg and did no work that day, and his daughter, with the rag curlers still in her hair, sat at the kitchen table and cried for an hour without stopping. In the front chamber above, the widow at number 17 sat on the edge of her bed and remembered the single rap she had heard in the night, and knew that she would have to say so, and knew what it would cost her to say it, and made herself ready to say it all the same. At the station house, a little before 6 in the evening, the desk sergeant closed his book on the day's entry and turned the page for the day that would follow. The young man in the cell at the end of the passage had by then been formally charged. He had said, at the charging, only that he had nothing to add to what he had said in the morning. The constable on the bench outside the door was relieved by another and went home to Kennington Park to his wife and his 2 children, and did not tell them where he had been. The sun went off the roofs of the New Kent Road. A lamplighter came round with his pole. And somewhere in a farmhouse near Wadhurst, in Sussex, a girl's mother was setting out plates for a supper her daughter would not come home to eat, and had not yet had the letter that would tell her why. The coroner, the crowd, and the committal. Come with me into the morning that followed. The night is behind us now, and I want you to feel the change of pace, because a chapter of this kind moves at the tread of men in aprons and men with pencils, and not at the tread of a constable on a stair. This is the sort of hour a parish gets through by hand, without hurry, and it is the sort of hour a listener can rest inside. The Mason's Arms stood on the corner of Manor Place, a plain public house with a low porch and a scrubbed step, of the kind that in the year 1860 every parish in inner London kept for the use of the coroner when there was no other room to be had. The tap-room had been cleared before 8 in the morning. The trestle where the porters usually took their beer had been pushed to the wall. 2 long deal tables had been set end to end down the middle of the floor, and around them a set of Windsor chairs had been carried in from the back parlour. A jug of water and a set of tumblers had been placed at the head. A brass inkstand had been fetched from the vestry of St. Peter's. The landlord, whose name I have seen given as Payne in one paper and Payne in another, and whose right spelling I have never worked out, stood by the counter in his sleeves and did not open the tap that day for the general trade. The coroner for East Surrey came a little after 10. He was Mr. William Carter, a solicitor of some years, a heavy man with a plain black frock coat and a bag of papers under his arm, who had held the office long enough to have taken an inquest in most of the streets between the river and the New Cross Road. He set his bag on the corner of the table. He drew his chair. He said good morning to the landlord and did not smile. He asked whether the jurors had come in and was told that 11 of the 12 were in the back parlour and that the 12th had been sent for and was on his way from a workshop on the Kennington Road. Mr. Carter nodded and drew a small watch from his waistcoat and looked at the face of it and put it away. You have to picture the 12, because they are the plain men of the case, and the papers gave them little space. They were the sort of jury an inquest of that district and that year threw up. A pawnbroker from the Walworth Road, a grocer whose shop stood at the corner by the chapel, a journeyman printer from the works at the Elephant, a schoolmaster from a school for boys on the New Kent Road, 2 cabinet makers, an ironmonger, a baker, a coach painter, a builder's clerk, a coal merchant, and, at the last, the man who had been sent for from the Kennington Road, who came in with sawdust still on the cuff of his coat. They were sworn one by one at the head of the table, each with his hand on a bound testament that the coroner's officer had brought in a black cloth. Then the coroner rose and told them plainly that their duty was to view the bodies of the deceased, and afterwards to sit at his table and to hear such evidence as would be brought before them, and to say by what means those 4 persons had come by their deaths. The viewing was the first part of it, and it did not take place inside the public house. That is a thing worth saying, because there is a picture that has grown up over the years of the 12 men filing past the 4 in the tap-room, and it is not right. The bodies had been taken the afternoon before to the dead house behind the Newington workhouse, a low brick building at the back of the yard, and it was there that the jury was walked, 2 by 2, with the coroner's officer at the head of the file and the landlord's boy at the rear. They came out of the Mason's Arms into the sun and turned along Manor Place toward the New Kent Road and passed under the gate of the workhouse and were let into the yard by a porter who did not say a word. What they saw inside the low brick building was not written down in the papers of the week, and I am not going to invent it for you here. They came out again after perhaps a quarter of an hour, in the same order, and they walked back to the Mason's Arms in silence, and the printer from the Elephant was seen by a neighbour on the step to be wiping the palms of his hands on the front of his coat as he came up the porch. When they were seated again, the coroner opened his book, and the taking of evidence began. It went on, in the way of a 19th-century inquest, with no barrister for either side, and no cross-examination worth the name, only the coroner himself, putting one question after another, in a level tone, and the officer at his elbow writing down the answers, in a long hand, that filled a page for every quarter of an hour of speech. There is a rhythm to that kind of hearing, and I would like you to feel it, because it is the rhythm the case ran on for the whole of the summer. Mr. Beard was called first. He stood at the head of the table with his hat in his hands, and gave the account you have already heard, of the pail of water on the step, and the mark under the door, and of the running of his daughter with her apron gathered up to the corner by the chapel. He was on his feet perhaps 6 minutes. He was thanked, and stepped back. The widow from number 17 was called next. I told you at the last that one paper set her name down as Beard and another as Bevan, and I have to tell you honestly that the record of the inquest does not clear the matter up either. She wore, by the account of a reporter who was in the room, a black bonnet and a shawl of dark wool that was too heavy for the weather, and she carried a folded handkerchief in her right hand which she did not use. She told the coroner about the single rap in the middle of the night, and about the scuffle of feet on boards. She told him also that she had not troubled to get up. She said that she wished now that she had. Mr. Carter did not press her on it. He thanked her, and she sat down, and a man in the second row of chairs by the wall reached across and put his hand on her sleeve for a moment, and she did not look at him. The constable of P Division came next, and after him the sergeant who had walked Youngman up the Walworth Road, and after them a second officer of the division who had gone into the front room at Manor Place with a lantern in the middle of the morning to make the first inventory of what was there. Each of these men gave his evidence in the language his trade had taught him, plain and short, without adjective, in the way the men of the division were trained to give evidence at a coroner's court. They named the things they had seen. They named the hour they had seen them. They did not describe. Then the surgeon was called, and here I want you to slow with me a little. He was Mr. John Bowen, of a house on Newington Butts, a parish surgeon of long standing, a small grey man of about 60, with rimless spectacles pushed high on the bridge of his nose. He had examined the 4 bodies at the dead house the previous afternoon, and again in the morning before the jury had come, and he had made his notes in a black-bound book, which he now opened on the table before him. He did not read from it. He spoke instead in the careful language such men used at inquests in that year, which was the language of the trade, and not the language of the street. He spoke of the wounds by their situation on the body, not by the picture of them. He spoke of the depth of them in inches, and of the angle of them relative to the plane of the shoulder, and of the direction from which the hand that had made them must have come. He did not once in the whole of his evidence use a word that could not have been said aloud in a schoolroom. That was a kindness, and it was a kindness the men of his generation understood how to give, and the jury took it from him with grave attention, and were spared a great deal by it. The papers of the week that followed would print his evidence almost in full, and would print it in the same careful language, and readers over the tea things at the far end of Kennington and Walworth would follow the sense of it without having any picture forced into their minds. There is something in that method that our own age has lost, and I have thought about it often, and I have never quite made my peace with the loss. Come out onto the porch of the Mason's Arms with me for a moment, because inside the room the coroner is now summing up in a low voice, and the officer is writing steadily, and there is nothing new to be said in there for a little while. Manor Place from the porch does not look very much like a street in a case. The Blackbird is in the copper gutter of number 17. The milk cart of the morning has long gone. Along the pavement toward the Walworth Road, a great press of people has gathered, and it is standing quite still. That is the thing to fix on, because it is the note the whole day sounded on. The crowd made no noise. There must have been, by the estimate of a reporter for one of the evening papers, 700 or 800 souls along that length of pavement by the middle of the afternoon, and every one of them was silent. Bonnets in a row along the railings. Working men with their caps in their hands. 2 women near the corner in aprons with their arms folded across their chests. Nobody was calling out. Nobody was pushing. It was not a mob in the ordinary sense of the word, and it did not behave as a mob behaves. It stood the way people stand at a graveside when the earth is being turned in. Inside, the summing up ended. The 12 men were told that they might, if they wished, withdraw to the back parlour to consider their verdict, or they might, if they were of one mind, deliver it from where they sat. They looked at one another along the deal table. The printer nodded to the schoolmaster. The schoolmaster nodded to the pawnbroker at the head. The foreman was the grocer from the corner by the chapel, and he stood up and cleared his throat and said that they were of one mind, and that their verdict on all 4 of the deceased was one of wilful murder, and that they named as the person by whose hand the deaths had been caused the young man who at that hour was sitting in a cell at the station house of the P Division, whose name they gave in full for the record. The coroner nodded. The officer wrote. The book was closed. I am going to move you now, gently, to the other end of the same case, because the coroner's verdict is only the first of the 2 doors that had to open before a trial could be held. The second door was at the Lambeth Police Court, and it is the magistrate at Lambeth who commits a man to the Central Criminal Court for trial. The formalities took a few days to arrange. The prisoner was brought over from the station house in a covered van on the morning of the Committal hearing, and the road from Newington to the court in Lambeth is not a long one, and the crowd along the pavement on the day the van went by was again a silent crowd, and again did not push and did not call. The magistrate at Lambeth was Mr. George Ellison Elliot, a barrister of the Inner Temple who had sat at that court for some 7 years, and who had, by all accounts, no love of a long hearing. He was a spare man with a thin grey beard and a habit of tapping the wood of his bench with the point of a pencil while a witness was speaking. The evidence that had been given at the Mason's Arms was gone through again before him, in the same order, with the same witnesses called in the same order, and the same surgeon giving his evidence in the same careful language. It took the best part of 2 days. Youngman sat in the dock throughout, in the clothes he had been given at the station house, and by the account of every reporter in the room, he sat with his hands folded in his lap and his face composed, and he answered when he was spoken to, and did not speak when he was not. At the close of the second day, Mr. Elliot laid down his pencil, and he said what any magistrate in his place must have said. He said that a case had been made out, and that the case would go for trial. He committed the prisoner to the next sessions of the Central Criminal Court, which by the calendar of that year fell in the middle of August, and he ordered that the prisoner be removed in the interval to Horsemonger Lane Gaol, which stood in Southwark on the far side of the Borough Road, and there kept in the ordinary manner until the day of his arraignment. Come out with me into the evening of that second day. The van had gone before the crowd on the pavement outside the court had thinned. The lamplighters were coming round with their poles, and one by one along the Kennington Road, the yellow flowers of the gas lamps opened in the dusk. In a farmhouse near Wadhurst in Sussex, a girl's mother had by then had the letter that told her why her daughter would not be coming home, and I will not take you into that room tonight, because there is nothing that can be said inside it that is not better said by leaving the door shut. In a set of rooms on the far side of the river, an old tailor sat at his board with a piece of grey worsted across his knee, and had not lifted the needle for an hour. In a cell in a great stone building in Southwark, a young man of not quite 25 lay on a pallet in the summer heat, and looked up at the small square of the window, and waited for the middle of August, and for the door at the Old Bailey to open, and for what the 12 men behind that door would decide, when the last of the evidence had been laid before them at last. The Old Bailey in August. Come with me across the summer to the middle of August, because a little more than a fortnight has passed since the door of the van closed on him at Lambeth, and the calendar of the Central Criminal Court has come round at last to the sessions that will settle the case. The gaol at Horsemonger Lane in Southwark had held him in the interval in the plain way it held any prisoner on remand in that year, in a cell on the north side of the great yard, with a barred window that looked out over the roof of the chapel, and I do not intend to keep you long in that cell before we go on together to the Old Bailey. The trial itself is what this hour is for, and it is where we should now stand. The Central Criminal Court in the year 1860 was not the building we know now. The dome and the figure of justice with her sword and her scales belonged to a courthouse that was not built until many years later. In the summer we are speaking of, the court sat in an older stone building on the same corner, hard against the wall of Newgate Prison, a low and heavy place of 2 stories, with a broad front and small square windows, and a set of iron rings sunk into the stones by the door for the tethering of the horses of the council. The main courtroom inside was a rectangle of dark wainscot, panelled to the height of a man's shoulder, with a bench at the far end raised 3 steps above the floor, and a dock in the middle raised 2, and a long table between them, where the counsel sat with their briefs and their inkwells. There were galleries at the back for the public, and a narrow press bench along the side for the reporters, and behind the judge's bench a great old print of the royal arms in a heavy gilt frame that had hung there since the reign of the late King George. The morning of the trial was very hot. That is a fact of the record, and every paper of the following week put it in. London had been in a spell of heat for the best part of a week, with the streets by the middle of the afternoon giving off the shimmer that a paved city gives off in summer, and the court by 10 o'clock in the morning was already close, and the high windows were down at the top to admit what little air the yard would give. The judge came in a few minutes after 10. He was Mr. Justice Williams, a spare man of about 60, in the scarlet and ermine that a judge of the Queen's Bench wore on a size, with his wig set square and his hands folded before him on the wood of the bench. He was known in his own profession as a patient man, not much given to the show of feeling from the bench, who kept his questions short and his temper level, and who preferred, in a case of this kind, that the summing up should be brief and that the jury should be trusted. The counsel for the Crown were led by a sergeant of the bar, and the counsel for the prisoner were led by a junior of some experience whose name the papers set down as Mr. Best. I will not pretend to you that I remember every one of the second row of gentlemen who sat behind them with their notes, because the reporters of that August did not always agree on the list, and it is not the sort of detail I would care to make up for the sake of a full picture. The prisoner was set in the dock at 10:15, in a black coat that had been sent to him at the jail by a cousin of his father, and in a clean linen shirt whose collar he had put up in the way a young clerk of the time would have put it up. And he stood with his hands on the wood of the rail in front of him, and he waited to be spoken to. The indictment was read out to him by the Clerk of Arraigns in the level voice of that office. It named the 4 persons who had died at number 16, Manor Place, on the night of the 30th of July, and it charged him with the wilful murder of each of them in turn, and it asked him at the end how he pleased to say. He said, in a voice that a reporter for one of the evening papers set down as low but clear, that he was not guilty. He said it 4 times, once for each of the 4. The clerk sat down. The judge nodded to the leader of the Crown, and the case for the prosecution began. Stay with me for the first hour of it. It went, in its main lines, as an ordinary murder trial of that year went. The sergeant for the Crown rose and put the case before the jury in an opening speech of perhaps 40 minutes. He set out the plan of the house at Manor Place. He set out the times at which each of the 4 had been seen alive on the Monday evening, and the times at which each had been found on the Tuesday morning. He set out the story the prisoner had told in the box room at 6 o'clock, of a father come across the river in the night, and he set out, without heat, the plain answer to that story, which was that the father had been at his own board on the far side of the river the whole of that night, and had been seen there by 3 living witnesses. And he came, at the end of his opening, to the paper that he said gave the case its shape. He held it up in his hand before the jury. He said that the young man in the dock had, some 6 weeks before the deaths, insured the life of the country girl he was to marry for the sum of £100, and that he had done so with money he did not have, and that on the death of that girl the sum would have fallen to him. The papers of the week would call it the letters, in the plural, because there was a small bundle of them, and I want you to hear them exactly as the jury heard them. The bundle was passed up to the leader of the Crown by a junior at his elbow, and it was untied on the table before him, and each letter was in turn taken up and read out in a level voice for the benefit of the 12 men on the bench along the side of the room. There was the first letter to the office on the Strand, in his own hand, asking about the terms of an insurance upon a life. There was the letter from the office back to him, on the printed paper of the company, setting out the premium and the medical form. There was his own reply, sending a name and an address at Wadhurst in Sussex, and asking that the papers be sent there for a signature. There was the note from the office at last, confirming the policy in force. And there was, folded inside the last of them, the small receipt for the premium, 3 shillings and 6pence, in the counting-house hand of a clerk. The whole reading took perhaps 20 minutes. The court was very quiet through it. The prisoner in the dock did not lift his hands from the rail, and he did not lift his eyes from the boards of the floor. The witnesses came next. They were, for the most part, the same witnesses who had stood at the head of the deal table in the Mason's Arms 3 weeks before, and they gave, for the most part, the same evidence in the same order. Mr. Beard, next door, with his hat in his hands. The widow at number 17. The constable of P Division. The sergeant who had walked him up the Walworth Road. The surgeon, Mr. John Bowen, of Newington Butts, who opened his black book and did not read from it, and spoke again in the careful language he had used at the inquest. I said to you at the last that there was a kindness in that language, and I will say it again now. The men in the jury box were spared, by his choice of words, a set of pictures they would otherwise have had to carry home. He gave them the wounds by their situation and their depth and their direction, and by no other measure. He was in the witness box perhaps 3/4 of an hour. When he stepped down, the counsel for the defence did not cross-examine him. Come out into the yard with me for a moment, because there was a break at the middle of the day, and I would like you to have the picture of the court in the recess. The counsel went out through a door at the side into a small room where a cold meat lunch had been set on a sideboard by an attendant, and the judge went up a private stair into his chambers, and the jury were taken by an officer to a room of their own at the back, where they were given tea and bread, and were not permitted to speak to anyone. The prisoner was taken down the steps at the back of the dock into a whitewashed passage below the court, and along that passage to a small cell where he was given a mug of water and a piece of the same bread the jury had, and where he sat on a wooden bench with his hands on his knees and did not eat. The court was cleared. The reporters on the press bench got up and stretched, and one of them went outside for the sake of a smoke, and did not come back for 20 minutes. The heat in the room had by then reached, by the account of one man who set it down in his diary that evening, what he called the temper of a bakehouse. The afternoon of the first day and the whole of the second was the case for the defence. It was, I have to tell you honestly, a very thin one. The plan of the counsel for the prisoner was, in its main lines, to press the story of the father as far as it could be pressed, and when the father himself was called by the Crown, and the plain fact of his being across the river all night was set before the jury by 3 separate mouths, to fall back upon the second line of a defence in that year, which was that the mind of the prisoner had not been sound on the night in question. Some cousins of his family were called, and they said the things that cousins in such a case tended to say, of odd behaviour in his boyhood, and of a headache he had once suffered for a week when he was 17. A surgeon of no great standing in his own profession was called for the defence, and he gave his opinion that a man might on a summer night lose the balance of his reason. He was cross-examined for a few minutes by the leader of the Crown, and it did not go well for him, and he stepped down looking older than he had when he had come in. At the end of the second day, the judge summed up. He did so, as he was known to do, briefly and without heat. He put the facts of the case to the jury in the order they had heard them. He said, of the story of the father, that they must ask themselves whether it stood a moment against the evidence of the 3 witnesses on the far side of the river. He said, of the plea that the prisoner's mind had not been sound, that the law required a great deal more than an odd temper or a boyhood headache to lift a man out of the ordinary responsibility for his acts. He said of the letters that the jury should give them such weight as in their own judgment they thought fit. He did not tell them what verdict to find. He set his notes aside. He asked them if they would withdraw. They did withdraw, though only just. They went out at a little after 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the second day, in the same file in which they had come in, and the door at the back of the box was closed behind them by an officer, and the court sat waiting in the heavy heat with the sounds of the street coming in faintly at the high windows. It was very quiet. The prisoner in the dock did not sit down. The reporters on the press bench held their pencils above their notebooks and did not write. The judge, on the bench above, folded his hands and looked at nothing in particular. Somebody in the public gallery coughed once and was hushed. Somebody's watch, in a waistcoat pocket, ticked. I have seen the interval given by one paper as 15 minutes, and by another as 12, and by a third as barely 10. The truth of it is that it was very short. The door opened again before a quarter of an hour had passed, and the 12 men came back in and sat down, and the foreman stood up. The clerk of arraigns rose. He asked them, in the level voice of his office, whether they were agreed upon a verdict. The foreman said that they were. He asked them, of the murder of the mother, how they said. The foreman said guilty. He asked them, of the murder of the elder son. Guilty. Of the younger son. Guilty. Of the young woman above stairs. Guilty. The clerk sat down. I would like you to slow with me for the next thing, because it is the moment of the whole trial, and it will not take long. The judge did not speak at once. He drew a square of black cloth from the bench beside him. He placed it upon the top of his wig, in the way a judge in that century placed it before the passing of a capital sentence, and he looked at the young man in the dock, and he spoke to him by his full name, William Godfrey Youngman, in the level voice a man of his years and his office had learned to keep for such an hour. He said the things that a judge in his place was required by his office to say. He named the 4 who had died. He said that the sentence of the court upon him was that he should be taken from this place to the place from whence he came, and thence to a place of execution, and that there he should be hanged by the neck until he was dead, and that afterwards his body should be buried within the precincts of the gaol in which he was last confined. And he ended, as a judge of that century ended in such an hour, with the words that closed every capital sentence pronounced in an English court that year, and may God have mercy upon your soul. The young man in the dock did not answer him. He put a hand for a moment to the rail as though he needed it there for the sake of his balance, and then he took it away again, and he stood and he waited. The officers at the side of the dock came forward. He was turned toward the steps at the back. He went down them without help, and the whitewashed passage received him again, and the door of a covered van at the yard door of the court received him after that, and the van went out under the arch and along the length of the Old Bailey, and turned south at the end of it, toward the river and the bridge and the borough on the far side. Come out onto the pavement with me. The evening of that second day was still very warm. The light was going off the top of the wall of Newgate, and the lamps along the length of the street were not yet lit. A small crowd was waiting on the flagstones of the far side of the road, and the crowd did not shout as the van went by, and did not follow it, and only stood and watched it go. In a farmhouse near Wadhurst in Sussex, a girl's mother sat at her supper without speaking to anyone at the table. In a set of rooms on the far side of the river, an old tailor set aside his work and went to the window and stood at it for a long time and did not turn on the lamp. And in a cell on the north side of the great yard at Horsemonger Lane Gaol in Southwark, a young man of not yet 25 lay down on a pallet under a barred window and looked up at the small square of the evening sky above the roof of the chapel, and heard, faintly, over the wall of the yard, the sound of a lamplighter beginning his round in the street outside. The drop at Horsemonger Lane. Come with me across the last short stretch of the calendar now, because between the sentence in the courtroom on the second day of the sessions and the morning we are moving toward there stood only a little more than 2 weeks. The law of the year 1860 did not keep a man long in the interval between the black cloth and the drop. The date was fixed by the sheriff's office for the 4th of September, a Tuesday, and the place was fixed by the same office as the flat roof of the gatehouse of Horsemonger Lane Gaol in Southwark, where the scaffold of the county of Surrey had stood for the better part of 40 years, and where the crowds of the borough had gathered in their tens of thousands for hangings within living memory of every man then walking the streets of the Newington side of the river. I want you to sit with me a little in the days before the morning, because there are things to be said about them, and then we will go out into the grey of the 4th of September together and stand where we have to stand, and we will not stand there long. The prisoner was moved, on the day the sentence was passed, out of the cell on the north side of the yard in which he had lain during the sessions, and into a smaller cell at the west end of the same building, the cell that in that jail and in that year was kept for the use of a man under sentence of death. It was a room of perhaps 10 feet by 6, whitewashed to the ceiling, with a barred window high in the wall that let in a square of light in the middle of the afternoon and no light at all in the morning. A pallet stood along the far wall. A wooden stool stood by the door. A small table under the window held a pewter mug and a Bible bound in dark cloth and a set of writing paper that had been placed there by the chaplain of the gaol. 2 officers of the county sat at the door of that cell in turn, day and night, from the closing of the door on the evening of the sentence to the opening of it on the morning of the drop, and they were changed at the striking of the hours by the clock over the chapel roof, and they did not speak to the prisoner unless he spoke to them first, and they did not read while they sat. The chaplain of Horsemonger Lane in that year was a Mr. Jessup, a clergyman of the Church of England of some 15 years' service at the jail, a spare man of middle height, with grey hair worn short, and a plain black coat that hung a little loose at the shoulders. He came to the cell on the morning after the sentence, and every morning after that, and he sat on the wooden stool by the door, with his hat on his knee, and he read a portion of Scripture aloud, and he prayed, and he asked the young man if he had anything he wished to say. In the first days there was little answer. By the middle of the second week, by the account the chaplain gave afterwards to a clergyman of a parish near his own, the prisoner had begun to speak of the letters, and of the office on the Strand, and of the girl at the London Bridge platform, and of a great many other things beside, and had at last, 3 days before the morning, given the chaplain what the chaplain called a full confession of the deeds for which he was to die. The chaplain did not print the confession, and the sheriff of the county did not print it, and the papers of the week that followed printed only that a confession had been made, and that it had, in its main lines, admitted the acts and denied nothing. The young man wrote, in the same interval, 3 letters at the small table under the window. The paper of them survives in the record of the gaol. and the hand is the same clerk's hand that had written the letter to the office on the Strand at the end of May. One was to his father across the river, and it was short, and I am not going to open it here, because the whole of what a son wrote in such an hour to a father he had accused in a box room at 6 in the morning is not the sort of thing to be pulled out for the sake of a listener. One was to a cousin at Wadhurst, and it was shorter still, and asked that a small kindness be shown to a farmhouse near the church there, and left the nature of the kindness to the cousin's judgment. The third had no address written on the outside. It was folded twice and left under the pewter mug on the table, and it was found there in the afternoon of the 4th of September when the cell was cleared, and it was passed by the deputy governor of the jail into the hands of a woman on the far side of the river who had been named to him by the chaplain, and what became of it after that I do not know, and I have never worked out. I want to move you now, very gently, to the outside of the walls, because the morning of the 4th of September will not begin inside the cell. It will begin in the streets of the borough in the small hours, and it will begin with the coming of the crowd. That is the thing to fix on, before the drop itself, because the crowd is a part of the record of this case that you cannot leave out. The papers of the following morning would put the number at somewhere between 20 and 30,000 souls. It is possible they were high. It is possible they were low. What is certain, and what every account of that morning agrees upon, is that the streets around Horsemonger Lane were full by 2 o'clock in the morning, and that they were full at every window along the length of the Borough Road and Newington Causeway, and that a man could walk from the corner of Union Street to the gate of the Gale only by the leave of the men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder in the roadway. They had come by every road, from the east along Long Lane, from the north over the bridges from the city, from the south by the Kennington Road and the New Kent Road. Whole families had come, with children on their fathers' shoulders. A great many young men had come in 2s and 3s with their sleeves rolled up. Costermongers had set out stalls along the pavement of the Borough High Street the night before, and were selling hot pies and porter and ginger beer out of tin trays. A ballad seller was going along the front of the crowd with a folded sheet on a stick, calling out the verses he had printed of a song about the Walworth Murders that he was offering for a penny apiece, and he was doing a good trade. In the windows of the houses that faced the gatehouse of the Gale, seats had been let for the morning at prices that ran, by the account of one paper, to as much as £1 a chair. Men were on the roofs. Boys were in the branches of the 2 plane trees at the corner of the street. A woman near the front of the crowd had brought a stool from her own kitchen and was standing on it in her bonnet, and had brought a piece of bread wrapped in a cloth for her breakfast. Come inside the walls with me now for the last hour before the door opens. In the cell at the west end of the building, a little before 5 in the morning, the chaplain came in for the last time and sat on the stool by the door and read the office for a man about to suffer the last penalty of the law. The prisoner was already up and dressed in the same black coat he had worn in the courtroom, and had eaten a little of the bread and drunk a little of the coffee that had been brought to him on a tray at 4. He knelt on the stone floor of the cell for the reading of the office, and answered in the responses in a low voice, and did not weep. When the chaplain rose, he rose also. When the door of the cell was opened by the officer, he went through it without help. He was walked in a small procession along the whitewashed passage from the cell to the door at the foot of the stair that led up to the flat of the gatehouse roof. The under-sheriff of the county went at the head in his plain frock coat, with a white wand of office in his right hand. The governor of the Gale came next, in a dark suit, with his hat in his hand. The chaplain came behind with his book. The prisoner walked between 2 officers of the county, who did not take him by the arm, and did not need to. The hangman went last, at a little distance, in the plain dark clothes he had worn to the Gale the night before, with a small leather bag at his side that held the pinions he would need at the top of the stair. He was Mr. William Calcraft of Hoxton, the executioner for the county of Surrey and for the city of London in that year, and the executioner for a great many other counties beside. He had held the office already for near 30 years, and he would hold it for another 14. He was, by every account of every man who knew him in his own trade, a plain and quiet man, of middle height, with a short grey beard and a soft voice, who kept pigeons at his house in Hoxton and was fond of children, and who did not speak of his work when he was not at it. The drop he used was the short drop of 2 or 3 feet that was the practice of the English scaffolds in the year 1860. It was not the long drop of a later generation, and it was not always merciful, and Mr. Calcraft himself, later in his career, would come in for a great deal of criticism on that account. On the morning we are speaking of, at the top of the stair at Horsemonger Lane, he did the work that his office required of him in the manner his office had taught him, and he did not delay. At the foot of the stair, the pinions were put on. The arms were bound at the elbows behind the back with a leather strap. A second strap was passed loosely around the knees to be tightened at the platform. The prisoner did not resist. He looked once at the chaplain and once at the under-sheriff, and he did not speak. The under-sheriff nodded to the officer at the door. The bolt was drawn back. The door at the top of the stair was opened. They came out onto the flat of the gatehouse roof in the grey of a September morning that was not yet full daylight. The sky over the roofs of the borough was the colour of old pewter. A thin drizzle had begun to fall, and had wetted the boards of the scaffold to a dull shine. The scaffold itself stood at the centre of the roof, a plain, square platform of black-painted wood, with a rail of iron around 3 of its sides and a set of steps leading up to it on the 4th. The beam above it was a single dark timber that ran from one upright to the other, with the rope already fixed to it, and the noose hanging at the middle of the beam at the height of a man's head. Below the platform, on the great roadway and on the pavements and on the roofs and at the windows, a sea of upturned faces stretched away from the front wall of the gale as far as a man on the platform could see in the grey light, and every face in it was quiet, and every hat and every bonnet was still. He was walked to the front of the platform. The under-sheriff read the warrant of execution aloud from a folded paper in a level voice that the wind carried only a little way. The chaplain, at his shoulder, said a last prayer. The strap at the knees was tightened. A white cotton cap was drawn down over the head, and the noose was placed around the neck and the knot set under the left ear in the manner Mr. Calcraft used. The hangman stepped back. The under-sheriff raised his hand and let it fall. Mr. Calcraft drew the bolt. I am not going to describe for you what followed. I told you earlier in this production that the horror in this history would always arrive quietly, and I will keep to that, and I will keep to it now more than ever, because this is the closing chapter, and it is late in your night. The record of the morning is in the papers and in the calendars of the Gale, and it is not hidden from anyone who wishes to look it out. It is enough to say here that the sentence of the court was carried out on the 4th of September in the year 1860 at the appointed hour, and that the young man of not quite 25, who had walked up the stair from the whitewashed passage, did not walk down it again. The body was left on the rope, in the manner of the year, for the full hour after the drop. It was then taken down and carried by the 2 officers along the passage at the top of the stair to a small room at the north end of the roof, and thence, in the afternoon, into a quiet corner of the yard within the walls, where by the sentence of the court it was buried without a stone and without a name, in the earth of the Gale in which he had last been confined. The crowd in the street outside did not disperse quickly. They had come a long way for this morning, and they were slow to turn for home. By the middle of the forenoon, the coster stalls along the Borough High Street had sold out of the pies. The ballad seller had sold every sheet of his song. The 2 plane trees at the corner of the street had emptied of boys. A woman in a bonnet was seen by a reporter to fold the piece of bread she had brought for her breakfast back into its cloth without eating it, and put it into her basket, and step down off her kitchen stool, and take up the stool under her arm, and walk away in the direction of the bridge without speaking to anyone. Come inside with me one last time. In a set of rooms on the far side of the river, in Wellington Terrace, an old tailor sat on the edge of a bed, and did not lift his head. In a farmhouse near Wadhurst in Sussex, a mother went out into the yard at the back of the house, and stood by a wall in the grey rain of that September morning, and looked at nothing. In the front room of number 16 Manor Place in Walworth, the shutters had been kept closed since the last day of July, and were closed still, and would remain closed for a good while yet, and the little house at the end of the row was very quiet. I have stood at the corner of Manor Place. It is not a place a stranger notices now. There is no plaque on the wall. The house of number 16 itself is gone. In its place, a plain range of small red brick dwellings of a later century, and a row of iron railings, and, on the pavement outside, a child's chalked hopscotch fading in the rain. It is very ordinary. That, I think, is the last thing to say. History, in the end, does not always leave a mark you can put your hand on. It leaves, more often, an ordinary street on an ordinary afternoon, and a listener in a quiet room a long way off, and the memory of 4 names that were once written in ink in the register of a parish in Surrey, and are written in it still. The candle has burned low. The rain has slackened over the roofs of the borough. The name of William Godfrey Youngman is closed now in the book of the year. Sleep well, sleep gently, and history, once again, turns the page in the dark.